The bus pulled into the station at exactly 7 in the morning. She stepped off with a small backpack over one shoulder and a violin case in her hand. The case was old. Really old. The leather had cracked in several places, and one of the latches didn't close properly anymore. She had wrapped a piece of cloth around it to keep it shut. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. She looked around the unfamiliar city. Everything seemed bigger here. The buildings stretched high into the sky, and people moved fast, like they were all late for something important. Back home, people walked slowly. They stopped to talk. They knew each other's names. Here, nobody looked at anybody else. Everyone was focused on where they needed to be. She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. The address of the concert hall was written on it in her grandmother's handwriting. Her grandmother's hands shook these days, so the letters were a bit wobbly, but she could still read them. She had memorized the address anyway, but she liked looking at the paper. It made her feel like her grandmother was with her somehow. The competition was called the National Young Musicians Championship. She had never heard of it until 3 months ago. A teacher from a nearby town had visited her village to help with a school program. He had heard her playing in the small church where she performed every Sunday. After the service, he found her and asked if she had ever thought about competing. She didn't understand what he meant at first. Competing? With her music? She played because she loved it, because her grandmother had taught her, because it was part of who she was. She had never thought of it as something to compete with, but the teacher was persistent. He explained that there were competitions where young musicians played in front of judges and audiences. The winners got scholarships, opportunities, chances to study at the best music schools in the country. He said she had a gift, and it would be a shame to hide it in a small village where only a few dozen people would ever hear it. She thought about it for weeks. Her grandmother encouraged her to try. "What's the worst that can happen?" Her grandmother said. "You play your music. People listen. Then you come home. But maybe, just maybe, something wonderful happens. You won't know unless you go." So she applied. She filled out the forms carefully, writing about how long she had been playing and who had taught her. She didn't have recordings from fancy studios or letters from famous teachers. All she had was a video her cousin had taken on his phone during a Sunday service. The sound quality wasn't great, and you could hear a baby crying somewhere in the background. But she sent it anyway, because it was all she had. 2 months later, she received a letter. She had been accepted to compete. She read the letter 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. Then she ran to show her grandmother, and they both cried a little, though neither of them would admit it later. Now here she was, standing in a city she had never visited, about to walk into a building full of strangers. She took a deep breath and started walking. The concert hall was impressive. It had tall columns at the entrance and wide stone steps leading up to the doors. She saw other young people arriving, and immediately she felt out of place. They came in nice cars, some with drivers who opened doors for them. Their instrument cases were shiny and new, with brand names she recognized from magazines. They wore clothes that looked expensive, the kind of clothes she saw in shop windows but never inside her closet. She looked down at herself. She was wearing her best outfit, the one she saved for special occasions back home. A simple white blouse and dark pants. Clean shoes that she had polished the night before. It was nice by her standards. But here, it looked plain. She felt invisible. And maybe that was okay. Maybe being invisible would make this easier. Inside, the lobby was full of activity. There was a registration desk where competitors were checking in and receiving their numbers. She joined the line and waited. The girl in front of her was talking loudly on her phone about the competition she had won last month in another city. The boy behind her was discussing his training schedule with his mother, mentioning private lessons with a teacher whose name seemed to impress everyone around them. When she reached the desk, the woman looked at her and then at her violin case with a slight raise of her eyebrow. "Name?" the woman asked. She gave her name. The woman typed it into the computer and frowned slightly. I don't see any institutional affiliation here. No conservatory? No academy? No, she said. I learned from my grandmother. The woman paused for just a second, then printed out a number and handed it over. Good luck, she said, but her tone suggested she didn't think luck would be enough. She took her number and found her way to the waiting area. It was a large room with rows of chairs, most of them already filled with competitors and their families. Some were warming up in corners, playing scales and difficult passages. The room was filled with the sound of overlapping music, like an orchestra tuning up, but never quite finding the same note. She found an empty seat in the back row, away from everyone else. She sat down and placed her violin case on the chair next to her. She didn't take out her instrument. She didn't feel like warming up in front of all these people. Besides, she had been playing since before sunrise that morning in her grandmother's living room. Her fingers knew what to do. As she sat there, she watched the other competitors. They seemed so confident, so sure of themselves. They talked about their teachers and their techniques. They discussed which pieces they had chosen and why those choices were strategic. One boy mentioned that his piece was selected specifically because it showcased the weaknesses of other competitors who played before him in the order. She didn't understand that kind of thinking. She had chosen her piece because she loved it, because it reminded her of summer evenings on her grandmother's porch, watching the sun set while the music floated out through the open windows, because it made her feel something deep in her chest, and she hoped it might make others feel something too. A girl about her age sat down nearby. She had a beautiful violin case, bright and new, with her initials embossed in gold. The girl looked at her and smiled politely. First time competing? She asked. Yes, she admitted. Is it that obvious? The girl laughed, not unkindly. A little. Don't worry. Everyone's nervous their first time. Where do you train? I don't train anywhere, she said. I mean, I practice at home. My grandmother taught me. The girl's smile froze for just a moment. Oh. That's nice. Very sweet. Then she turned away to talk to someone else. And the conversation was over. She didn't mind. She was used to being underestimated. In her village, people had doubted her too at first. A young girl with an old violin, learning from an old woman who had never been to any music school herself. But her grandmother had learned from her own mother, and that mother had learned from hers. The music had been passed down through generations, taught not in classrooms but in living rooms, not from textbooks but from the heart. She thought about her grandmother now. Probably sitting by the radio back home, waiting for any news. She had wanted to come, but the trip was too long and too expensive, and her health wasn't what it used to be, so she had pressed some money into her granddaughter's hand. Money she had been saving for months, and made her promise to call as soon as it was over. A voice came over the loudspeaker, announcing that the competition would begin in 30 minutes. Competitors were asked to gather in the main hall. She stood up, picked up her violin case, and followed the crowd. Whatever happened next, she was ready. She had her music, and she had her grandmother's voice in her head, reminding her to breathe, to feel, to let the music speak for itself. The rest was out of her hands. The main hall was even more impressive than the lobby. Rows of red velvet seats stretched back from the stage, enough to hold maybe 1,000 people. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, catching the light and scattering it across the walls like tiny stars. She had never been in a room this grand. The church back home could fit maybe 60 people if everyone squeezed together. This was something else entirely. She found a seat near the back, away from the front rows where most of the other competitors had gathered with their families. She preferred it here. She could see everything, without being seen. She could watch and learn before her turn came. The judges sat at a long table near the front of the stage. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women. They all had serious faces and expensive clothes. Name cards sat in front of each of them, but she was too far away to read what they said. One of the men, the one sitting in the middle, seemed to be in charge. He had gray hair swept back from his forehead and wore glasses with thin gold frames. He kept checking his watch, like he had somewhere more important to be. A woman walked onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the competition. She explained the rules. Each competitor would perform their prepared piece. The judges would score them on technical skill, emotional expression, and overall presentation. The top 10 performers would move on to the final round tomorrow. Simple enough. The first competitor was called to the stage. A tall boy with perfect posture and a violin that looked like it cost more than her grandmother's house. He played beautifully, hitting every note with precision. The audience applauded politely when he finished. The judges wrote notes on their papers. One by one, the competitors performed. Some were excellent. Some were good. A few made small mistakes and tried to hide their disappointment as they walked off stage. She watched all of them carefully, not to judge, but to understand. These were people who had trained their whole lives for moments like this. They had teachers and coaches, and practice rooms with perfect acoustics. They had everything she didn't have. But as she listened, she noticed something. Many of them played perfectly, but something was missing. The notes were right. The timing was right. But there was a coldness to it, like they were performing a math equation instead of telling a story. Her grandmother always said that music wasn't about the notes on the page. It was about the spaces between the notes, the breath, the heartbeat. Anyone can learn to play the right notes, her grandmother would say. But not everyone can make people feel something. After about 2 hours, her number was called. Number 47. She stood up, and her legs felt shaky. She took a deep breath, the way her grandmother had taught her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Feel your feet on the ground. You are here. You are ready. She walked down the aisle toward the stage. She could feel people looking at her old violin case, her simple clothes. She heard a whisper from somewhere nearby. Is that thing held together with a rag? Someone laughed quietly. She kept walking. The stage felt enormous when she stepped onto it. The lights were bright and warm on her face. She could barely see the audience beyond the first few rows. But she could see the judges, clearly. They were looking at her with expressions that ranged from bored to mildly curious. The man in the middle, the one with the gray hair and gold glasses, leaned forward slightly. He looked at her violin case, then at her face, then back at the case. Something flickered in his eyes. Not interest, exactly. More like amusement. Before you begin your prepared piece, he said, his voice smooth and deep, I'd like to try something a little different. She stood still, waiting. This wasn't part of the rules that had been explained earlier. No one else had been asked to do anything different. I notice you don't have any formal training listed in your application, he continued. You learned from your grandmother. Is that correct? Yes, sir, she said. Her voice was steady, even though her heart was pounding. How charming, he said. The word charming sounded like it meant something else, something smaller. Well, since we don't have any references to verify your skill level, perhaps we should start with something basic, just to establish a foundation. She didn't respond. She didn't know what he wanted. He smiled. And it wasn't a kind smile. Play. Twinkle. Twinkle. Little star for us. I assume you know it? A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. She saw some of the other competitors in the front rows, exchanging glances, smirking. The girl with the gold initials on her violin case covered her mouth to hide her smile. She understood what was happening. He was testing her, but not in a fair way. He was trying to embarrass her. He had looked at her application, seen that she had no famous teachers or fancy schools, and decided she didn't belong here. This was his way of putting her in her place. For a moment, she felt something hot rise in her chest. Anger. Maybe. Or hurt. She thought about her grandmother, who had spent years teaching her, who had given her everything she knew about music. She thought about the money her grandmother had saved, the sacrifices she had made just so her granddaughter could stand on this stage. And now this man, this judge who didn't know anything about her, was trying to make her feel small. But then she remembered something else her grandmother had said. When people try to make you feel small, don't fight them with anger. Fight them with excellence. Show them who you are through your music. That's a language everyone understands. She took another breath. The anger faded, replaced by something calmer, something stronger. Yes, sir, she said. I know it. She set her violin case on the small table provided on stage. She unwrapped the cloth that held it closed, and she heard more whispers from the audience. The case looked even older, under the bright stage lights. The leather was cracked and faded, and one corner had been repaired with tape that was starting to peel. But when she opened the case and lifted out the violin, something changed. The instrument itself was beautiful. Old? Yes, but beautiful. The wood had a deep reddish-brown color, worn smooth by generations of hands. It caught the light differently than the shiny new violins the other competitors carried. It seemed to glow from within. She tucked the violin under her chin. It fit perfectly, the way it always did. This violin had been her grandmother's, and her great-grandmother's before that. It had been played at weddings and funerals, at celebrations and quiet evenings. It had more stories in it than she could ever tell. She lifted her bow. The audience was silent now, waiting. Some were waiting for her to fail. Some were just curious. The judge with the gold glasses had a small smirk on his face, like he already knew how this would end. She closed her eyes for just a second. She thought about her grandmother's hands, guiding hers when she was just a little girl. She thought about the first time she had played a whole song without making a mistake, and how her grandmother had cried with joy. She thought about Sunday mornings in the church, playing for people who had known her since she was born, who clapped not because she was perfect but because she was theirs. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't nervous anymore. She wasn't angry anymore either. She was ready. The bow touched the strings, and the first note filled the hall. It was just the beginning of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the simplest melody. But what came next would change everything. The first note was simple, just a single, clear tone floating out into the hall. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive. Just the opening of a children's song that everyone in the room had heard 1,000 times before. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. The judge with the gold glasses wrote something on his notepad without even looking up. He had already decided what this would be. A basic performance from a basic girl with no real training. Something to get through before the real competitors took the stage again. But then the second note came, and the third, and something started to change. She wasn't just playing the melody. She was stretching it, bending it, letting it breathe in ways nobody expected. The simple tune began to shift and grow, like a seed opening into a flower. The notes were still recognizable. Still the same song every child learns, but they were wrapped in something deeper, something older. Her bow moved across the strings with a kind of grace that couldn't be taught in any classroom. It came from somewhere else. From years of playing in a small living room while her grandmother hummed along. From Sunday mornings when the sunlight came through the church windows and made everything feel sacred. From late nights when she played just for herself, just because the music needed to come out. The melody climbed higher, and she added ornamentation. Little turns and trills that danced around the main notes like fireflies in the dark. It was the style of the old masters, the composers who lived hundreds of years ago. But she made it sound fresh and alive. The audience began to sit up straighter. The whispering stopped. Even the people who had laughed before were now leaning forward, trying to understand what they were hearing. Then the music shifted again. The classical ornaments faded, and something new emerged. A jazzy rhythm, loose and playful, the same melody, but now it swung and bounced, like it was being played in a smoky club instead of a grand concert hall. Her fingers moved faster, finding notes between the notes, bending the pitch in ways that made the old violin sing like it was laughing. A woman in the third row put her hand over her heart. She didn't even realize she was doing it. The music was reaching inside her. Finding something she had forgotten was there. Son. Axis. Axis. And her heart. Beside her, a man who had looked bored all morning was now watching the stage with his mouth slightly open. The jazz faded, and the music grew quiet. Softer. Slower. The melody was still there, but now it was dressed in sadness. She shifted to a minor key, and suddenly the children's song became something heartbreaking. It sounded like loss, like memory, like looking at an old photograph of someone you loved who was no longer here. She thought about her grandfather as she played this part. He had died when she was very young, but her grandmother still talked about him all the time. He used to sing this song to their children, her grandmother said. He had a terrible voice, couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but he sang it anyway because it made the little ones laugh. Now, whenever she heard the melody, she thought of him, and she poured that feeling into the music. In the audience, an older man wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He was thinking about his own father, who used to hum the same tune while working in the garden. The music had unlocked something in him, a door he had kept closed for years. Then the tempo picked up again. The sadness lifted, replaced by something triumphant. The melody soared higher and higher, building and building. Her bow flew across the strings so fast it was almost a blur. The sound filled every corner of the hall, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling, wrapping around every person in the room. She wasn't thinking anymore. She wasn't counting beats or remembering fingerings. She was just playing. The music was flowing through her like water through a river, natural and unstoppable. This was what her grandmother had always talked about. The moment when you stop playing the music and the music starts playing you. The other competitors watched in stunned silence. The girl with the gold initials on her case had stopped smiling. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She had trained at the best conservatory in the country. She had won 3 national competitions. But she had never heard anything like this. She had never felt anything like this. The boy who had performed first, the tall one with perfect posture, was gripping the armrests of his seat so hard his knuckles had turned white. He understood technique. He understood theory. But this girl on stage was doing something that couldn't be found in any textbook. She was turning a simple song into a journey, and everyone in the room was traveling with her. The judges had stopped writing. All 5 of them were just watching now. The woman on the far left had tears running down her cheeks, though she didn't seem to notice. The man next to her had removed his glasses and was rubbing his eyes like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And the judge in the middle, the one with the gray hair and the gold glasses, the one who had asked her to play this song as a way to embarrass her? His smirk was gone. His face was blank, but not empty. It was the face of a man whose entire understanding of something had just been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a few minutes. She brought the music back down now, returning to the original melody. Simple again. Pure. But it was different, this time. After everything the audience had just experienced, this simple tune felt like coming home after a long journey. It felt like peace after a storm. The final note hung in the air. She held it, letting it ring out until it faded naturally into silence. Then she lowered her bow and stood still. For a moment, nothing happened. The hall was completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of a failed performance, but something else. A sacred silence. The kind of quiet that follows something extraordinary when people need a moment to remember how to breathe. She looked out at the audience. She couldn't see their faces clearly because of the lights, but she could feel something. An energy in the room that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted. Something had changed. Then, From somewhere in the middle of the hall, someone started to clap. Just one person at first. Then another. Then another. And then, like a wave building in the ocean, the applause grew and grew until it crashed over the entire room. People were standing up. Not just a few people, but everyone. Row after row, they rose to their feet. The applause thundered through the hall, echoing off the walls, filling every corner with sound. Some people were cheering. Some were crying. Some were doing both at the same time. She stood on the stage, her grandmother's violin still in her hands, and she didn't know what to do. This had never happened to her before. In her village, people clapped politely after she played. Sometimes her grandmother would hug her and tell her she did well. But this was something completely different. This was 1,000 strangers telling her, with their hands and their voices and their tears, that she had touched something inside them. She felt tears prick at her own eyes, but she blinked them back. Not yet. She wasn't finished, yet. This was just the warm-up, the silly little test the judge had given her to prove she didn't belong. She still had her real piece to perform, but as she stood there, bathed in the applause of 1,000 people, she realized something important. She had already proven everything she needed to prove. The rest was just music. The applause continued for what felt like forever. She stood on stage, not sure if she should bow, or wave, or do something else. In her village church, she would simply nod and walk back to her seat. But this was different. This was 1,000 people on their feet, clapping so hard, their hands must have hurt. Finally, the woman who had welcomed everyone at the beginning of the competition walked onto the stage. She was smiling, but she also looked a little confused, like she wasn't quite sure what had just happened. She raised her hands, and slowly the applause began to fade. People sat back down, though many of them were still wiping their eyes or shaking their heads in disbelief. "Well," the woman said into the microphone, her voice slightly unsteady, "that was certainly unexpected." She turned to the judge's table. "Shall the competitor continue with her prepared piece?" The judge in the middle, the one with the gray hair and gold glasses, didn't answer right away. He was staring at the girl on stage like he was seeing her for the first time, which, in a way, he was. A few minutes ago, she had been nobody to him, just another unqualified hopeful who had somehow slipped through the application process. Now, she was something else entirely, something he couldn't quite name. He cleared his throat. "Yes," he said. "Please continue." She nodded and lifted her violin again. The hall fell silent immediately. Every single person was watching her now, waiting to see what she would do next. The air felt electric, charged with anticipation. Her prepared piece was different from the simple melody she had just transformed. It was a classical composition, something written by a famous composer over 200 years ago. It was technically demanding, full of fast passages and difficult fingerings. Many professional musicians struggled with it. She had chosen it because her grandmother loved it. Because on quiet evenings, her grandmother would hum the melody while cooking dinner, and she had always wanted to learn to play it properly. She closed her eyes for just a moment, finding her center. If the audience thought they had seen everything during her first performance, they were wrong. This was something else entirely. The classical piece demanded precision and speed, and she delivered both. Her fingers danced across the strings with impossible accuracy. Her bow moved in ways that seemed to defy physics. But more than the technique, more than the skill, there was emotion. Deep, rich, overwhelming emotion that poured out of the violin and filled the entire hall. She played like she was telling the story of her life. The quiet beginning was her childhood, learning at her grandmother's knee. The building middle section was her growth, her struggles, her small victories. And the triumphant finale was this moment. Right now. Standing on a stage she never dreamed she would reach. When the last note faded, the silence returned. But it was different this time. Heavier, more profound, like the whole room was holding its breath. Then the applause exploded again, even louder than before. People jumped to their feet so fast that chairs scraped against the floor. Someone in the back was shouting, "Bravo!" over and over. A woman in the front row was openly sobbing, not even trying to hide her tears. She bowed this time. A small, humble bow, the way her grandmother had taught her. Then she carefully placed her violin back in its worn case, wrapped the cloth around it, and walked off the stage. Backstage, everything was chaos. The other competitors were gathered in small groups, talking in urgent whispers. When she walked past, conversations stopped. People stared at her like she was some kind of ghost. A few of them looked angry. Most just looked stunned. The girl with the gold initials on her violin case approached her. Her earlier confidence was gone. She looked smaller somehow, younger. "How did you do that?" she asked. Her voice wasn't mean this time. It was genuinely curious, maybe even a little desperate. She thought about the question for a moment. How could she explain something that she didn't fully understand herself? The music wasn't something she did. It was something that happened through her, like she was just a channel, a vessel for something bigger than herself. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just play what I feel." The girl stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly and walked away without another word. She found a quiet corner and sat down on a wooden bench. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. She looked at her fingers, the calluses built up over years of practice, the small scars from strings that had broken at the wrong moment. These hands had done something extraordinary today. She still couldn't quite believe it. A staff member came to find her about an hour later. The competition was finished. All the competitors had performed. The judges were making their final decisions. Everyone was asked to return to the main hall for the announcement of who would advance to the final round. She walked back into the hall and found a seat in the back row again. The energy in the room had completely changed since that morning. People kept turning around to look at her. Some smiled. Some whispered to their neighbors while pointing in her direction. She tried to ignore it all and focus on the stage. The 5 judges were seated at their table, papers spread out in front of them. They seemed to be having a quiet discussion. The judge with the gray hair was listening to one of the women, nodding slowly. His expression was impossible to read. Finally, the woman who had been hosting stood up and walked to the microphone. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for your patience," she said. "Our judges have made their decisions. Before we announce the 10 competitors advancing to tomorrow's final round, I want to remind everyone that this has been an exceptional day of music. Every single person who performed today should be proud of themselves." She paused, looking down at the paper in her hand. "The following competitors will advance to the final round, in no particular order." She began reading names. One by one, competitors stood up and made their way to the stage. Some looked relieved. Some looked surprised. The girl with the gold initials was called, and she walked forward with her head held high, though she glanced back toward the girl in the back row with an unreadable expression. 9 names were called. 9 competitors stood on the stage. There was one spot left. The woman looked at her paper, and a small smile crossed her face. "And our final competitor, advancing to tomorrow's round." She paused, letting the moment stretch. Number 47. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt like they were made of water. Around her, people were applauding again, though it seemed muffled somehow, like it was coming from very far away. She walked down the aisle toward the stage, and with each step, the reality sank in a little deeper. She had done it. She had actually done it. When she reached the stage and turned to face the audience, she saw something that made her heart stop for just a second. In the very back of the hall, near the door, an older woman was standing. She was leaning on a cane, and her silver hair was pulled back in a familiar bun. She was crying and smiling at the same time, her weathered hand pressed against her heart. Her grandmother. She had come, after all. Somehow, she had found a way. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the competition, not the judges, not the other competitors standing beside her. There was just the two of them, connected by years of love and music and sacrifice. Her grandmother nodded slowly, and she understood exactly what that nod meant. I'm proud of you. You did it. And this is only the beginning. The next morning came faster than she expected. She had barely slept. After the announcement, she had rushed to the back of the hall and wrapped her arms around her grandmother so tightly she was afraid she might break her. They had stood there for a long time, just holding each other, while people streamed past them toward the exits. Her grandmother had taken 3 buses to get here. 7 hours of travel, with her bad hip and her cane. She had left before sunrise, telling no one, carrying nothing but a small bag with a change of clothes and the last of her savings tucked into her pocket. You didn't think I would miss this, did you? She had said, laughing and crying at the same time. I've waited my whole life to see you on a stage like that. They had found a small hotel nearby, the cheapest one they could afford. The room was tiny, with just one bed that they shared, like they used to when she was a little girl. And thunderstorms scared her. They talked late into the night about everything and nothing. About the competition. About home. About the future that suddenly seemed so much bigger than it had before. Now it was morning, and the final round was only a few hours away. She sat on the edge of the bed, her violin case beside her. Her grandmother was brushing her hair, the way she used to do when she was small. Long, gentle strokes that felt like love made physical. Are you nervous? Her grandmother asked. A little, she admitted. Yesterday felt like a dream. What if I can't do it again? What if it was just luck? Her grandmother stopped brushing and put her hands on her shoulders. Look at me, she said. She turned around. Her grandmother's eyes were bright and fierce, full of the same fire that had carried her through 80 years of hard living. What happened yesterday was not luck, her grandmother said firmly. Luck doesn't practice for 10 years. Luck doesn't wake up before dawn to play scales. Luck doesn't pour its whole heart into every single note. She cupped her granddaughter's face in her wrinkled hands. What you have is a gift. But more than that, what you have is dedication. You earned this. Never forget that. She felt tears threatening to fall, but she blinked them back and nodded. The final round was held in the same grand hall, but it felt different now. The audience was even bigger than yesterday. Word had spread about the girl, with the old violin, who had turned a children's song into something magical. Reporters had gathered near the entrance. Cameras flashed as competitors arrived. When she walked in with her grandmother, people turned to look. Some pointed. Some whispered. A reporter tried to approach her, but a staff member gently steered him away. After the competition, the staff member said, not before. Her grandmother was given a seat in the front row. A special seat, reserved for family members of competitors. She looked out of place among the wealthy parents in their designer clothes. But she held her head high and smiled at anyone who looked her way. She wasn't ashamed of who she was. She never had been. The final round was structured differently. Each of the 10 competitors would perform a piece of their own choosing. The judges would score them, and the top 3 would receive scholarships and opportunities to study at prestigious music academies. The winner would also receive a cash prize and a chance to perform with a professional orchestra. She drew number 7. Right in the middle. She would have to wait and watch 6 others perform before her turn came. The performances were excellent. These were the best of the best, after all. The ones who had made it through yesterday's brutal competition. Each one played with skill and passion. The audience applauded warmly after each performance. But something was different today. She could feel it in the air. People were waiting for her. Even as they clapped for the other competitors, there was an undercurrent of anticipation. They wanted to see if yesterday had been real. They wanted to see if she could do it again. When her number was finally called, she stood up and walked to the stage. The applause that greeted her was louder than what the others had received. Not polite applause. Eager applause. Expectant applause. She looked out at the audience and found her grandmother in the front row. The old woman was sitting up straight, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes shining with pride. She gave a small nod. "You can do this." She lifted her violin to her shoulder. The hall fell silent. She had chosen a different piece for today. Something her grandmother had taught her years ago. A melody that had been passed down through their family for generations. It wasn't written in any book. It didn't have a famous composer's name attached to it. It was just a song, created by ordinary people who wanted to express something that words couldn't capture. She began to play. The melody started soft and gentle, like a lullaby. It spoke of home, of belonging, of the simple joys that make life worth living. Then it grew stronger, telling stories of struggle and hardship, of dreams that seemed impossible, and the courage it takes to chase them anyway. And finally, it soared into something triumphant, a celebration of everything beautiful and good in the world. She played with her eyes closed, letting the music flow through her. She thought about her grandmother, about her mother who had died too young, about the grandfather she never knew. She thought about her village, the people who had supported her, the church where she had first learned to play. She thought about every person who had ever believed in her, and every person who had doubted her too. When she finished, the silence lasted longer than it had yesterday. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, an eternity. Then her grandmother stood up. Just her. At first, an old woman with a cane, rising slowly to her feet. And then the person next to her stood up. And then the whole front row. And then the row behind them. Like dominoes falling in reverse, the entire audience rose in a standing ovation that shook the walls. She opened her eyes and saw 1,000 people on their feet. She saw the judges standing too, something they hadn't done for anyone else. She saw reporters scrambling for their cameras, and she saw her grandmother, tears streaming down her face, clapping her weathered hands together with all the strength she had. The results were announced an hour later. She won. First place. The scholarship, the prize money, the chance to perform with a professional orchestra, all of it. But that wasn't the moment she would remember most. The moment she would remember most came later. After the awards ceremony. After the reporters finally finished their questions. Her grandmother had pulled her aside, into a quiet corner, away from the crowds. "I have something for you," her grandmother said. She reached into her small bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. She unfolded it carefully. It was a photograph. A young woman standing on a stage, a violin in her hands, a smile on her face. She looked almost exactly like her. "Your great-grandmother," her grandmother said softly. "She played too. She was extraordinary, just like you. But back then, there were no competitions for people like us. No scholarships. No opportunities. She played her whole life in our village. And only a few dozen people ever heard her." Her grandmother's voice trembled. She used to dream about a stage like this, about a chance like this. She never got it. But you did. She stared at the photograph. At this woman she had never met, but who had given her everything. The music that flowed through her veins had started here. With this face. These hands. A gift passed down through generations, waiting for this moment. "Play for her," her grandmother whispered. "Every time you step on a stage, play for her, and for all the ones who never got their chance." She folded the photograph carefully and pressed it against her heart. "I will," she promised. "I will." And she did. For the rest of her life, every note she played carried their memory with it. The grandmother, who believed in her. The great-grandmother, who dreamed of stages she would never see. And the simple truth that her grandmother had taught her from the very beginning. The simplest songs have the most room for soul.